December 7th, 1941. The skies above Pearl Harbor were alive with the deafening roar of engines, an ominous sound that would mark the beginning of a new era in warfare. Raymond T. Swenson stood on the tarmac, his leather gloves tight around the controls of his B-17 Flying Fortress. The scent of jet fuel filled the air as he looked up at the massive silhouette of the bomber, its wings stretching out like the arms of a giant, ready to take flight into the chaos of the Pacific skies. The attack on Pearl Harbor had shattered the peace, and the world was forever changed. But for Raymond, this moment was more than just a response. It was a calling. Swenson's gaze hardened as he adjusted the straps of his flight suit. His mind raced not just with the intensity of the war, but with the responsibility that came with commanding such a powerful machine. The B-17 was no ordinary bomber. It was a flying fortress, built to withstand the harshest conditions, to deliver destruction from the skies, and to carry its crew through the hell of aerial combat. And now it was his turn to be part of its legacy. "Raymond, it's time," the voice crackled over the radio, snapping Swenson back to reality. He nodded to himself, taking one last look at the base, where the destruction of the harbor still smoldered in the distance. His crew, a group of men from all walks of life, awaited their orders. Each man in that cockpit was driven by the same fire, the desire to fight back, to avenge the lives lost in the attack. But that fire came at a cost. No one could fully understand the weight of war until they faced it. The engines of the B-17 roared to life, and Swenson's hands gripped the controls with a newfound determination. They were heading into enemy territory. The horizon, once calm, was now a battleground, and their mission was one of survival. As the bomber took to the skies, the enormity of the task ahead settled over Raymond. He wasn't just a pilot, he was the guardian of his crew, the keeper of their hope. Every decision would matter. Every maneuver could mean life or death. "All clear," came the voice from the crew in the back. Swenson nodded, pushing the throttle forward, feeling the immense power of the B-17 as it climbed into the air. The Pacific stretched out beneath them, vast and unforgiving, but it was the only path to victory. As the B-17 ascended into the sky, Raymond felt the hum of the engines beneath him, the gentle vibration of the aircraft that had become an extension of his own body. His eyes scanned the horizon, an expanse of endless blue. But beneath that surface, the tension of war pulsed, unseen but always present, the calm before the storm. And then from the corner of his eye, he saw them. Enemy fighters, a dark speck in the distance. At first, they were nothing more than dots in the sky, but in seconds they grew, and the realization hit. This was it. The fight had begun. Raymond's heart raced, but his hands remained steady on the controls. He had trained for this. He had been through simulations and drills. But nothing could prepare him for the reality of what was to come. The B-17 was built to endure, but would it be enough? "Incoming!" The voice of his tail gunner cut through the radio static. The first rounds of fire from enemy aircraft rang out, and Swenson's heart skipped a beat. The B-17 shuddered, but it held firm. They were under attack. But Raymond knew this was only the beginning. Every bomber in their formation was a target, and every moment would test their resolve. "Hold tight, everyone!" Swenson's voice was calm but urgent, the weight of command pressing on him as the B-17 dove into evasive maneuvers. The sound of enemy fighters closing in grew louder, the air crackling with tension. The first battle in this war was happening right above the Pacific, and Raymond was in the center of it. The B-17 rocked again as enemy fire found its mark. The tail gunner fired back, but the enemy was relentless. Raymond's thoughts raced. His crew, his plane, the mission. Everything depended on this moment. He pushed the bomber harder, angling the nose toward the horizon, hoping to break free of the enemy's grasp. But the question remained, would the B-17 hold up under fire? Would they make it through the storm? The roar of the engines mixed with the sound of bullets flying past, and Raymond's world narrowed to the cockpit. There was no room for hesitation. Every decision had to be immediate, instinctive. The fate of the mission, the lives of his crew, and the legacy of the B-17 rested in his hands. The tension in the air was palpable. The battle was just beginning. And the hardest part? They were just getting started. The roar of enemy engines was deafening now. Raymond T. Swenson's B-17, the Iron Giant, was diving and swerving, evading the enemy fighters that swarmed around them like vultures. The sound of machine gun fire crackled through the air, each burst vibrating through the massive bomber's frame. Raymond's hands were a blur on the controls, his mind sharp and focused, but something in the pit of his stomach gnawed at him. This wasn't just a battle for survival, it was a battle for their humanity. "Keep it tight, watch your six," shouted his co-pilot, Lieutenant George Hartman, as he manned the radio, relaying orders to the crew. The B-17's crew was a well-oiled machine, each man knowing his role in this high-stakes game of life and death. But the chaos outside the cockpit was something that couldn't be prepared for. There was no manual for the fear creeping into their minds, no drill to handle the weight of the moral dilemma unfolding in the heat of the moment. Raymond's mind raced as the B-17 shuddered with every near miss. He glanced over at his bombardier, Corporal Tom Davis, who was crouched over his station, eyes fixed on the instruments in front of him. Davis was a quiet man, but even through the tension, Raymond could sense the unease in him. It wasn't the fear of death that plagued him, but the fear of what they were doing, what they might have to do. The B-17's tail gunners opened fire again, the bursts of ammunition lighting up the dark sky. But the enemy fighters kept coming, relentless and unyielding. The bomber's armor was holding, but Raymond could feel it beginning to strain. He could see the trail of smoke from the engines of the other bombers in the formation. Some were hit, some might not make it back. "Raymond, we've got a fighter on our tail," yelled Sergeant Jim Riley, the tail gunner, over the intercom. His voice was strained but controlled. Raymond nodded, his fingers gripping the controls tighter. He had heard Riley's voice many times before, calm in the face of chaos. But today was different. Today they were at the edge of something darker. Swenson's thoughts began to spiral. He had been a pilot for years, had fought in countless mock battles. But this was real. The B-17, this flying fortress, wasn't just a weapon of war. It was a symbol of strength, of hope for the Allied forces. But with each enemy that came into view, Raymond's heart tightened. These weren't faceless targets. They were men, just like him, caught in the same hellish web of war. And in that moment, the realization hit. War was not a game. There was no true victory here, just survival. A sharp jolt snapped Raymond from his thoughts. The fighter on their tail had opened fire, and the B-17 groaned under the pressure. They were losing altitude. He could feel the shift, the warning signs. The bomber was no longer responding as it should. "We've got a fuel leak, Raymond. Left wing's compromised," shouted Hartman, his voice thick with urgency. Raymond glanced at the fuel gauges. One of them was dipping dangerously low. He quickly calculated their options: return to base, try to make it to another airfield, or continue the mission despite the damage. But they weren't even halfway to their target. His mind spun as the realization hit. He had to make a choice. Raymond glanced back at Davis, who was now looking up from his bombardier's sight, eyes wide with disbelief. "Sir, I don't think we're going to make it back at this rate." For a brief moment, everything seemed to freeze. The noise of the engines and the gunfire faded into the background, replaced by the silence of his own thoughts. Raymond could see the fear in his crew's faces, the tension in the air. Every man in that cockpit knew the risk of continuing, but each one also knew the consequences of turning back. If they didn't push on, they would fail their mission, and failure meant more than just an unsuccessful attack. It meant that Pearl Harbor, that their comrades, their families, would have died for nothing. "You keep your head in the game, Davis," Raymond snapped, his voice sharp. His crew needed him to remain strong. "We're not turning back. We've got a mission to complete." But in that moment, Raymond felt the weight of leadership more than ever before. He wasn't just the pilot, he was their commander, the one who made the choices. And right now, his choice was between life and death, not just for himself, but for his entire crew. If they pushed on, they might make it, or they might not. The pressure was unbearable, yet he knew there was no turning back. The cockpit filled with the rhythmic sound of radio chatter, the words from his crew like distant whispers in the storm. "Enemy fighter at 3 o'clock!" Riley yelled over the intercom. Another fighter swooped down, this one closer, its engine growling like a beast in the night. Raymond's heart raced as he swerved the B-17 to the left, narrowly dodging the incoming fire. Bullets pelted the side of the aircraft, but the Fortress kept flying, its wings strong, its crew unyielding. "Hold on tight," Raymond shouted, steering the bomber into a dive. The B-17's engines screamed as the plane descended rapidly, cutting through the sky like a knife. His crew braced for impact, gripping their stations, their faces tense with the knowledge that at any moment they could be shot down. Suddenly, there was a deafening explosion. The world shook around them. The fuselage groaned, and the B-17 pitched violently. Raymond's heart skipped a beat as the pressure in the cockpit built. "What was that?" Hartman shouted, trying to steady himself in his seat. "Direct hit to the engine." The engineer, Corporal Frank Moore, called out from the rear. "The left engine's gone, sir. We're losing power." "Can we make it?" Raymond's voice cracked, the fear slipping through his steady composure. They were barely clinging to the sky now. The decision was no longer about continuing the mission. It was about survival. His hands gripped the controls, but the weight of what was happening pressed heavily on his chest. The moral dilemma that had been brewing in his mind now reached its peak. If he kept pushing forward, they might not make it back. If he turned back now, they would lose everything they had fought for. He wasn't sure which was worse, the thought of failure or the thought of sacrifice. The horizon ahead seemed endless, dark, and unforgiving. Every second felt like an eternity. Would they survive? Would they complete their mission? In the distance, he could see the flashing lights of the enemy fighters, circling like sharks. Raymond had to act fast. His hands gripped the controls again, steady and determined. The B-17 might be a flying fortress, but its fate, like his crew's fate, was uncertain. And in that uncertain moment, Raymond knew one thing for sure. Something was about to break. The B-17 flying fortress shuddered violently as it plummeted through the sky, its left engine sputtering, leaving a trail of smoke in its wake. Raymond T. Swenson's heart raced, but his hands remained steady on the controls. The situation was dire. The crew had already faced a barrage of attacks, and the bomber was barely holding together. Every jolt, every crackling burst of gunfire reminded him that they were pushing their luck, and the machine was beginning to show its limits. "Left wing's taking too much strain. We can't keep this up." Sergeant Jim Riley's voice cracked through the intercom, strained and panicked. His words were like a slap in Raymond's face. Reality had set in. The plane was crippled. The enemy was closing in, and his choices were dwindling fast. Raymond's eyes darted across the instruments. The fuel gauge was dangerously low. The left engine was on fire, and the remaining one was rapidly losing power. They were miles away from any friendly airfield, surrounded by hostile territory. In front of them, the sky was a minefield of enemy aircraft, and below, the vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean stretched endlessly, a cold reminder of the depths that awaited them if they fell. His mind raced through options, but the truth was brutal. Their chances of surviving this were slim. Should they continue the mission and risk the lives of his crew, or abandon the mission and retreat, sealing the failure of their mission and the larger war effort? "Raymond, we're losing the tail section," shouted Frank Moore, the engineer, his voice filled with desperation. "The fuselage is buckling under the pressure. If we don't do something now, we're going down." It was a choice no leader should ever have to make. But here it was, staring him in the face. Push on and risk everyone's life, or turn back and live with the consequences of failing to deliver the blow to the enemy that was so desperately needed. Raymond's thoughts flashed back to the moment he had first taken this plane's controls, the weight of responsibility settling over him. The B-17 wasn't just a weapon, it was the embodiment of the fight, of the resolve that had propelled them all into the skies that morning. They had come this far, but how far could they go? The intercom crackled, bringing Raymond's focus back to the present. "Enemy fighters closing in from 12 o'clock, shouted Lieutenant George Hartman, the co-pilot, his voice full of urgency. "We can't outrun them with this damage, Raymond." Raymond's heart pounded. His eyes scanned the horizon, and there they were. Enemy bombers, their dark shapes looming like vultures, waiting for the kill. They were fast and they were deadly. There was no way they could outrun them, no way they could dodge their attacks. Their only chance was to fight. We don't have the luxury of turning back, Raymond finally said, his voice cold, decisive. Prepare for battle. Roger that, Hartman responded, his tone steady despite the fear lurking beneath it. Gunners, be ready. This is going to be a rough one. Raymond's hands tightened around the controls as the B-17's nose dipped lower, evading incoming enemy fire as best as they could. The tail gunners, Riley and Corporal Jack Miller, opened fire in unison, their weapons ringing out in a barrage of bullets. But the enemy planes kept coming. The sky was filled with a deadly dance as tracer rounds lit up the air around them. Come on, come on, Raymond muttered to himself as the bomber groaned and shuddered, every hit from the enemy rattling the entire craft. His mind was on overdrive, calculating escape routes, evaluating their chances of making it back. But there was no time for hesitation, no time for doubt. Raymond, shouted Davis the bombardier, the enemy's diving. They've got us in their sights. Raymond's eyes locked onto the approaching bombers. He could feel the weight of the decision pressing on him. The B-17 had been built to endure, to weather the worst and return home. But even the flying fortress had its limits. His crew's lives were in his hands, and he could sense the pressure mounting, each second ticking away as if the entire world was counting on him to make the right call. We've got to take them down before they do, Raymond shouted, his voice booming in the cockpit. All guns, open fire. Give them everything we've got. The roar of machine guns filled the air, the deep thud of the tail and nose gunners hammering into the enemy fighters. But the enemy wasn't backing off. They were closing in for the kill. Through the barrage of gunfire, Raymond's mind kept returning to one brutal question: how much longer could they survive? The damage to the B-17 was severe, the fuel running out, the enemy pressing harder. Every move he made could be the difference between life and death, not just for himself, but for every man aboard. We can't keep this up, Raymond, Riley's voice crackled in his ear, tight with fear. We're out of options. We need to bail. Raymond's breath hitched. The words felt like a punch to the gut. Bail. It was the only word that mattered now. Abandon the mission. Abandon the fight. It meant failure. It meant defeat. But worse, it meant they might never get another chance like this. Pearl Harbor, the lives that had been lost, all of it. Could they really turn their backs on that? For a split second, everything froze. The chaos outside the B-17 faded, and Raymond was left alone with the crushing weight of his responsibility. To continue, they might die. To retreat, they would lose everything they had fought for. Neither choice was easy. Neither choice offered any comfort. In that moment, something inside Raymond snapped. His gaze hardened and his hand tightened around the controls. There was no turning back. We push on, he said firmly, the decision made. We finish what we started. The crew knew what that meant. They all knew it. They weren't just soldiers now. They were symbols, standing firm in the face of impossible odds. The B-17's wings were ragged, its engines sputtering, but it was still flying. And as long as it was, they would fight. The enemy bombers were almost upon them now, but Raymond didn't flinch. He wasn't afraid of death. Not now. Not after everything they had already endured. His heart beat with the pulse of the mission, the goal to strike back, to show the enemy that they could not break them, no matter how great the odds. He wasn't going to let his crew go down without a fight. The tension in the air thickened as the B-17 soared toward the oncoming bombers. Raymond gritted his teeth and pulled back on the yoke, throwing the massive plane into a steep climb. The crew's voices erupted in unison as the enemy fired again, the skies above them now a deadly maelstrom. The final battle was upon them. The decision had been made. And Raymond knew that whatever came next, they would either make it through together or they wouldn't make it at all. The B-17 shuddered once again, its fuselage creaking as enemy fighters closed in from every angle. The once imposing iron giant now felt fragile, like a wounded beast desperate to hold on. Raymond T. Swenson's heart pounded in his chest as he fought to maintain control, pushing the limits of the battered bomber. His hands were slick with sweat, but his grip on the controls remained unwavering. They had made their choice, to continue the fight, to see it through no matter the cost. Raymond, shouted Lieutenant George Hartman, his voice tight with desperation. We can't outrun them. They're going to take us down. The words hit like a hammer. They were trapped. The B-17, though still defiant in its flight, was faltering, its left wing leaking fuel, its engines barely able to sustain the altitude. Yet despite the damage, they pressed on, the horizon growing closer, and the enemy fighters closing in like wolves on a hunt. Raymond's mind raced. He had a decision to make: fight to the bitter end or sacrifice it all to save his crew. He could feel the weight of every man's life resting on his shoulders. They had already defied the odds to get this far. Could they really make it back home? The bomber groaned again, as if to answer his thoughts. No, not like this. His gaze shifted to the bombardier, Corporal Tom Davis, whose face was twisted in concentration and fear. Davis had been quiet for most of the flight, but Raymond could see the conflict in his eyes now. The bombardier looked up, meeting Raymond's gaze for a brief moment. Raymond, I don't think we're going to make it. Not with this damage. If we don't bail soon, we're done, Davis said, his voice trembling but resolute. Raymond nodded grimly, but he had made his decision. We keep going. We finish this. Before Davis could respond, a new sound pierced the air, an ominous whistle, followed by an explosion so violent it shook the entire B-17. The blast sent a wave of panic through the crew as the bomber jolted violently, tilting sharply to the right. For a split second, it felt as though the world had turned upside down. "We've lost the tail," Riley screamed from the back of the plane, his voice panicked and breaking through the chaos. "The rudder's gone. We can't control the damn thing." Raymond's eyes widened. The tail had been torn apart by the blast. The B-17 was now a crippled bird, losing altitude rapidly, its flight path erratic. His mind went into overdrive. They couldn't turn back. They couldn't make it back to base now. The engines were down to a sputtering whisper, and the plane was falling apart under the pressure. "Raymond, we need to bail! Now!" Hartman's voice cut through the air, firm and final. Raymond's pulse quickened, the weight of the decision crashing down on him. His crew, his men, they trusted him. But he knew that some of them wouldn't make it. The tail was gone, the left engine was on fire, and the remaining engine was fading fast. There was no way they could keep fighting, no way they could make it home. He looked out the cockpit window, the enemy fighters now circling, waiting for the kill. They were done no matter how much they fought back. But Raymond wouldn't let them go out without a fight. "Give me a minute," he barked at Hartman, his voice raw but determined. His eyes flicked to the control panel, then back to the horizon. There had to be one last chance, one last maneuver they could pull off. The crew's voices crackled over the intercom, urging him to bail, but Raymond blocked them out. He knew what he had to do. His hands moved quickly, his mind sharp, even as the bomber descended towards certain destruction. With a fierce determination, he pushed the throttle as far as it would go, coaxing the last bit of power from the failing engine. "Get ready, everyone," Raymond said through gritted teeth. "We're going to make a run for it." He angled the B-17 sharply, heading straight for a cluster of enemy bombers. It was a risky move, one that could very well be their undoing. But if he could take down just one more enemy plane, it would buy them a little more time. Time they didn't have. As he locked his sights on the nearest enemy bomber, the cockpit filled with the deafening sound of gunfire and the furious rumble of their own weapons returning fire. The enemy planes scattered in a chaotic dance, trying to avoid the B-17's final attempt at resistance. The B-17's nose jerked as the remaining tail gunner opened fire once more, sending a stream of bullets into the enemy. The enemy bomber, struck by a deadly barrage, exploded in a brilliant flash of light, and for a brief moment, it felt like victory. Raymond's heart pounded in his chest, the brief surge of triumph blinding him to the reality of their situation. "We've got one down," shouted Riley from the tail. "We've got them off our tail." Raymond's hands shook with the adrenaline of the moment. The bomber lurched once more, but it was still flying, barely. The enemy had pulled back, no longer pressing as hard as before. It was a fleeting moment of victory, but Raymond knew they had bought themselves some time. "Raymond," Hartman yelled, "we can't do this forever. We need to bail out now." But there was no time. The bomber was no longer a weapon. It was a ticking time bomb. The damage was too severe, and there was no way to keep the fight up. Raymond knew it. His crew knew it. "I'm not leaving you, not yet," Raymond said, his voice strained, his eyes scanning the sky for a way out. We're making it home, or we're going down together. For a moment, it seemed as if fate had conspired to grant them a brief reprieve. The enemy fighters had pulled back, and the B-17, though still crippled, continued to climb toward the distant horizon. But then, just as Raymond thought they might make it, a loud crack echoed from the right side of the plane. The wing, torn from the explosion earlier, had finally given way. The B-17 tilted sharply to the right, and Raymond felt the force of the G's pulling against him. The cockpit was filled with blinding light as the wing separated from the aircraft, sending the flying fortress into a fatal spin. Raymond's last words were shouted, though no one could hear them over the deafening crash of the wind and the violent shudder of the plane. "Jump! Now!" The world outside the cockpit went black. The crash was not a single event. It was an unfolding nightmare. As the B-17 spun uncontrollably through the air, Raymond Swenson's mind moved through a rapid series of images. His crew, the faces of the men who had trusted him, the desperate fight, the flickering flames on the left wing. In those final moments, when the bomber's descent reached its fatal climax, he felt a strange sense of peace, an acceptance of what was to come. He had done everything he could. He had fought for his crew, fought for the mission, and now his body was pulled from the cockpit, hurled into the chaos of the fall. But just as quickly the rush of wind stopped. His body hit the cold waters of the Pacific below, the icy shock stealing the breath from his lungs. For a moment, Raymond floated in the ocean's embrace, gasping for air. His mind swirled as he tried to regain his bearings. What had happened? Was he dead? No. He could still feel the bitter chill, the salt water in his throat. He struggled to stay afloat, but a sense of overwhelming fatigue washed over him. Slowly, his thoughts began to clear. He had survived. He had somehow survived the wreckage of the flying fortress. But the question lingered. At what cost? The days after the crash blurred together. Raymond floated for what felt like an eternity, the sun beating down on him during the day, and the cold ocean swallowing him during the night. He had no clear memory of how long he'd been adrift. Whether it was days or hours, he couldn't tell. But as he spotted a rescue plane in the distance, the relief he felt was bittersweet. He was being saved, yes, but at what cost? The memory of the men he had led, of their courage, of their final moments on the plane, haunted him with each passing wave. His crew, they hadn't made it. They trusted him to bring them home, and now they were gone. Each face, each name, echoed in his mind, along with the haunting thought, could I have saved them? Raymond's mind was a battlefield, and it wasn't the physical injuries from the crash that tore at him. It was the psychological wounds. He had led his crew into a battle they couldn't win. He had made the call to press on when he should have turned back. His leadership, his decision, had cost them their lives. And no amount of survival, no amount of redemption would ever erase that weight. When Raymond was finally rescued by a U.S. Navy vessel, his body was weak, his spirit fractured. He had survived, but he had lost something far greater. The faces of his men haunted him every time he closed his eyes, and the guilt of their deaths became a constant companion. He was brought back to the mainland, but the sense of victory that once came with survival was now tainted. His recovery was slow, but his mind raced constantly. There was no escape from the internal war that raged within him. No amount of time would heal the deep psychological wounds left by his choices. The memory of his crew, of their faces and their trust in him, followed him relentlessly. Raymond spent the next months processing the trauma of the crash, the loss, and the moral consequences of his decisions. He visited their families, the families of the men who had perished under his command. Each visit was a painful reminder of what had been lost and what could never be undone. He had no words that could ease their grief, no actions that could undo the irreversible. He could only offer them his apologies, his regret, his guilt. But as the days passed, Raymond came to understand something deeper about leadership and sacrifice. He had made the choice to press on, to fight for the mission, and in the process, he had paid the ultimate price. But in his grief, there was also a profound truth. The cost of war is not measured in victories or failures, but in the lives it takes, and in the decisions that haunt those who survive. It was not easy to reconcile with himself. He still questioned his decisions, still doubted whether he had done the right thing. But over time, he realized that in war, there are no perfect choices. Every decision carries weight, and sometimes the only choice is to make the best one with the knowledge you have. That perhaps was the hardest lesson to learn. The realization that survival came at the expense of his crew's lives, and no amount of blame could change that. In the years that followed, Raymond Swenson continued to serve, but he never forgot the lessons he had learned in the sky. He became an advocate for those who came back from war, speaking out about the psychological toll of combat and the burdens carried by those who survived when others didn't. The men who perished under his command had taught him the most important lesson of all. Leadership is not about perfection, it is about sacrifice, and it is about carrying the weight of those decisions with dignity. He would never be the same man he was before the mission, before the crash, before the loss. But in the quiet moments when he would sit alone and remember, he understood that the true cost of war wasn't just the destruction it caused. It was the lives that were lost, the decisions that haunted those who lived, and the humanity that was sacrificed for a larger cause. In the fall of 1943, Raymond received a letter from a mother who had lost her son in the same battle. The letter was short, but its words were enough to pierce the weight in his chest. "I don't know why my son had to die," the letter began, "but I know that he was proud to fight. I hope you can find peace with what happened. I hope you know that you gave him a purpose." Raymond folded the letter and placed it carefully in his jacket pocket. It was not forgiveness, nor was it absolution, but it was something. And for Raymond Swenson, that was enough to keep moving forward.